Well, I'm really excited to be joined with Dr. Chelom Leavitt. She's got a master's from BYU and a Ph.D. from Penn State in marriage and family and human development. And she does a lot of research around mindfulness and healthy sexuality. And I think this area is so important that we struggle so much about how to educate ourselves and children around sexuality. But to incorporate that mindfulness piece, I know that's really big with mindful parenting, but to think about how that could actually enhance healthy sexuality is wonderful. So I'm so excited to learn more about your work. And first, I just want to start by, how did you get into this area of mindfulness and sexuality?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was doing my dissertation work at Penn State, and that's when I was exposed to mindfulness, and really the mindfulness research field began in the early 90s, and it was a way for people to reduce pain that couldn't otherwise be controlled. And Jon Kabat-Zinn was one of the first, implementers of this, and started researching it. And then it kind of moved into the education field. So teachers and children, how it impacted the classroom. And what they saw is it really impacted teachers' ability to not burn out so quickly.
Wow.
They were taking care of themselves better. And so I was just listening to this presentation on kind of the history of it and where it was, being used right now. And I was studying sex. I had been studying sex for quite some time already. And I thought, gosh, this has got to have some application with sexual outcomes and how people experience sex. And so I started researching, and there was nothing out there. There was a little bit on some, other related things. And so I just started developing a measure to actually measure mindfulness during a sexual experience.
Wow.
And that's where I began. And it's just kind of gone from there. And it's just exploding in the last, year or two or three, because I think it just makes sense to us, right? That as we slow down, as we're more aware of our body, and we're just a little more intentional or curious about our experience, we'll have a better sexual experience. We'll connect better with that loved one.
Yeah. Well, as a psychologist and researcher, now I'm really curious about your measure and how you were assessing mindfulness during sexual activities. Like, how did you construct that, and what specifically are you looking for?
Yeah, great question. So we looked at what mindfulness measures were out there that just looked at mindfulness in your everyday life, right? Like, I'm aware of the feel of the pavement under my feet as I walk along, so those sorts of things. Those would be questions that researchers would ask to assess how mindful you were in your daily life. And so we looked at the same things. There were kind of 5 facets of mindfulness in some measures, but we found that in sex, there were only 2 facets that really mattered, that had strong associations with other outcomes. And that was being aware of our body and our experience, and then being non-judgmental of ourself, but also of our partner, right? So as I'm engaged in, sexual behavior, am I aware of the sensations and the emotions and the thoughts I'm having? But am I also non-judgmental? Like, do I get hung up on some thought that, pops in my head during sex, and then the whole experience is ruined because of that judgment that I've given of myself or of my partner?
Yeah, I love those 2 facets. And instantly I can think of all these barriers that would get in the way of those. 'Cause it seems so simple to, be aware and don't be critical of yourself or your partner. And yet many people struggle with spectatoring, where they're kind of observing outside, but not really participating. And they're not really in their body or present during sexual activity. And sometimes there can be a lot of performance anxiety, where you're just worried about things and all this pressure, and all of those pressures and judgments really interfere with a natural sexual response.
Yeah, so what we see is that, everybody has a little heightened anxiety, even if it's just excitement, right? It doesn't have to be negative anxiety, but just a little excitement that we kind of lose focus of that connection with our body during sex. And maybe we're focused on like, oh, I need to have an orgasm, or I need to
Yep.
perform a certain way. So we start getting goal oriented instead of kind of relaxing and understanding that just the moment to moment connection and experience of sex is really where we're going to find our most satisfaction and connection with our partner.
I love that. And I think about some of the challenges that I've seen. Often I work with a lot of religious individuals where sexuality is quite uncomfortable, and often there's a kind of a negative relationship with your own body. So to think about being more present with your body and being more aware of those thoughts and arousal and desire seems quite challenging for some people that grew up in a situation where we didn't talk very openly around sexuality.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we kind of reframe sexuality. And even, in a religious context, sexuality is this beautiful part of our development and our expression with a committed partner. Whenever I talk about healthy sexuality, I generally help people understand that it's most likely to occur, healthy sexuality is most likely to occur within a committed relationship. We see that over and over in research, that it's in committed relationships where we can really have these high levels of communication and connection and trust that creates the best environment for us to be vulnerable, to share this most intimate part of who we are and talk about our emotions and our fears and our dreams, all of these things that are really quite sensitive. And the best way for us to do that is to be in a really stable, committed relationship.
Mm. I love just hearing you talk about that. It feels so optimistic and hopeful where we can have these conversations and connections. How would you help somebody begin their mindfulness journey in relation to healthy sexuality? If they're like, wow, that seems like an impossibility. Like,
Yeah.
how would you help somebody start that?
Yeah. So, I teach a lot of classes where students are, maybe they came from a background where sex was a little taboo or just wasn't talked about, or wasn't talked about in a healthy way anyway. And so, what I always remind them is that this is a process.
Mm.
We're not going to automatically, do an about face and have a healthy attitude all of a sudden. It's just little things that we challenge ourselves. Maybe we keep a journal about what our attitudes are today. And then as we keep challenging ourselves to have more healthy attitudes about sex, we just write down what our thoughts and feelings are. And, over time, we see that we're making great progress. And so it's just little steps like being mindful of your day-to-day experiences, being mindful while you eat. Can you slow down and actually taste the food and feel the texture in your mouth and kind of slow that process down so that it's not something you rush right by and miss all these details. And so the same thing can be practiced in our everyday life. As I'm walking across campus, am I noticing, the sun on my face and the little breeze or the cold, the cold air, whatever it is? Am I aware of those little things? And then, how do I apply that to my sexual relationship? So, and that's a bigger jump. So we have to kind of practice this little day-to-day mindfulness techniques, and then we can apply it to our relationship. Are we aware of our emotions when we talk to our partner? Are we expressive? Or do we feel brave enough to share things with them that are really vulnerable? And so, keep a journal and just notice things about yourself and how well you're doing. And praise yourself. That's one thing about mindfulness is there's no judgment. You know, if you feel like, when I first started practicing mindfulness, I would say to myself, oh my gosh, I'm so lousy at this. Well, that's exactly not being mindful. So you
Right.
could say, every time I bring my attention back to my body and my breath, that's a success. That's victory. And so you just keep doing that and praise yourself when you actually get it right.
I love that idea because mindfulness, it's really not designed to like get rid of problems or
Yeah.
to solve these issues. And I use a lot of mindfulness in my work with anxiety and depression and trauma and sexual concerns, but it's much bigger than that. It's a way to engage in your life in a more meaningful, intentional, fulfilling way. And I think when I take that attitude, it really transforms that experience where a lot of people have this maybe view of mindfulness. So it's like, oh, I'm not going to sit and meditate. I'm not going to do that. And like what you're describing is just be a little bit more aware of your thoughts. And even as you're walking or eating, it doesn't have to be this
Mm-hmm.
really formal, regimented practice where you're counting your breaths. It can be
Right.
just more as you're living your life. For me, I do some formal mindfulness practices, but for me, often it's more of an attitude and being aware of those judgmental thoughts and more curious about those emotions and interactions and being more present. It is a practice, but it's also kind of an attitude towards living.
Absolutely. I think the word that I like the most is acceptance.
Mm,
Like, I'm just going to accept myself for how I am right now. And once I can do that, I can start building on it, right? I can start challenging myself and saying, well, I can see that I was really upset over this, interaction that I had with my partner. It's understandable. So give yourself a little compassion,
yeah.
and then say, the next time, I think what I could do is just focus on my breathing instead of getting so wound up and going into this same old pattern that we always get into. I'm just going to take a step back, and I'm going to think about why that might be a little trigger for me, why I might respond that way. And I think what it allows us to do is to just be more intentional,
Yeah.
right? I'm going to step back and say, I can see why maybe he said that, or that was his response. And instead of getting into this pattern of, devolving down this spiral that we usually do, I'm going to take a step back and just be a little more intentional.
Yeah. I think one thing you mentioned there is so key is slowing down unlocks our ability to engage in that process. And I think
Yeah.
about just how complex we are with our experiences and our emotions and then trying to navigate that with another human. If we're going really quickly and we're not aware of that, that's when we get into conflict and misunderstandings. And for me, the faster I go, the more judgmental I find myself being. But as I slow down and think about, oh yeah, this is what's going on, those judgments tend to melt away and we can actually learn and even enjoy those interactions that can be quite challenging. And mindfulness allows us to slow down and engage in that.
Yeah. And in fact, learn because I think we're curious. We're like, I wonder why that seems to be a trigger for me, or that seems to be our pattern between each other. And so then we can we can uncover things that we previously weren't even aware of.
Yeah. And that curiosity is so key because I think for a lot of people who end up struggling with sexual concerns like unwanted pornography viewing, it often comes from a place of curiosity about, how do bodies work? How does sex work? We didn't really talk about this. I don't understand the mechanics. And it's coming from a very innocent place of curiosity for a lot of people. So how do you help people adopt that more curious view in relation to how they perceive their body and also how they kind of engage with sexuality?
Well, you have to be aware of what good sources are, and pornography is not likely to be a good source to teach us about meaningful connections in a sexual relationship. And so I think finding some good sources, and then, keeping a little journal about what you're curious about, and maybe through some good study, we could give some good resources even here,
Yeah.
of how people can find good information, and then start digesting that good information and seeing how that feels, how they process that in their lives, and then challenging maybe some of the attitudes they grew up with, maybe shame, if they were shamed over just the whole topic of sex. Why would we feel shame over something that is as beautiful and connecting and developmental as sex? It's something that's intended to bring us closer to another person, so we can share these really intimate moments that include not only physical intimacy, but maybe even more importantly, emotional intimacy.
Yeah.
I think we see that in lots of different sex research, that people who report having the most satisfying sexual experiences are those that are able to communicate at a really expert level, and those that are willing to be vulnerable because there's this sense of trust in the relationship. So I think starting to question our own ideas about sexuality are going to be really helpful in that process of learning to be more mindful during sex.
I like that. So even from the education piece, you're already advocating for a mindful approach to learning, whereas you're learning and going through actual helpful resources. And I agree, pornography is not a teacher for intimacy or sexuality or relationships. But as you engage in better quality, more accurate information, be thoughtful and reflect on what reactions are you having and what attitudes come up, and be curious about that. Even as you're learning, you can be mindful in that learning process.
It's interesting because, there's a whole field on mindful eating, and part of what they teach is, don't shame yourself over what you eat. Just be aware and start to notice how you feel after you've eaten something. So be curious and aware of those sensations even after you've eaten. So after you digest information about sex, or you're engaged in a sexual relationship and maybe certain sexual behaviors, you engage in certain sexual behaviors, just kind of ponder and think about how you feel afterward. Was this a good thing for me to do? Did this help me feel more connected and peaceful and accepted in this relationship? Or is it something that maybe I want to tweak? Maybe I don't want to engage in that particular way.
I think that's wonderful, and so different from our fast-paced society where it's like, let's move on to the next thing so quickly. And when we do that, we miss out on those opportunities about what our experience is trying to teach us. And that requires slowing down and listening and reflecting. And often I find myself having difficulty carving out the time and space to do that.
Yeah, we know that women who struggle with sexual functioning, like orgasm consistency or arousal, they often are also not very mindful. And we know that for women in particular, it's really important to pay attention and be mindful during our sexual experiences. Women are just a little more complex in their sexual response, all of the things that contribute to their sexual response. And so it's especially important for them to kind of slow that process down, take the time to make sure that they're aware of arousal, of emotions, moment to moment in a sexual interaction.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on the sexual response. That's something I haven't talked about much in these interviews. And we often have that old Masters and Johnson, here's these 4-phase sexual response. And I think about, oh, that's neat and simple. But I think it's probably a lot more complex and And for women, sometimes that 4-phase system doesn't seem to be as helpful. I'm
Yeah,
curious your
exactly.
thoughts on that sexual response and what that looks like for men and women, and what's
Yeah.
similar and what might be different.
Well, I'm so glad you asked, because I actually just published an article on this in Journal of Sex Research about challenging the Masters and Johnson's
Yeah.
sexual response cycle, that it isn't that simplistic, particularly for women. I think we had a sample of over 1,000 women, and we looked at what their sexual response cycle looked like. And it broke into about 6 different patterns. Some women were pretty low, had pretty low arousal and just a little peak in their arousal. Some women were consistently high, and some women followed kind of that traditional pattern, but then there were other women with different patterns. So we saw 6 different patterns. And what was really wonderful about this research is that 5 of those patterns were associated with good outcomes. So what that tells us, I think, is that women are different. They're different from each other. They're particularly different from men. And so it's okay. Women need to embrace who they are, how they respond to arousal, to the relationship, and not feel like they need to be comparing themselves to their partner.
Yeah.
Right? And his patterns, we looked at men's patterns too. And men had a little narrower range, but there was some variation there too. So again, we need to be more accepting of who we are and just embrace that moment to moment arousal so that we can really connect emotionally with each other.
Yeah, I love that. And I find myself going back to something you said earlier, and I want you to elaborate a little bit more. And you said, like, why would there be any shame around something that's so connecting as sexuality? And often I find myself having that conversation with people. And they're like, there's no way I can ever accept this part of me, that I can feel okay in my body, that sexuality can be a good thing, an acceptable thing. And you came from a completely different direction, where it's like, why would there be shame around this? Like, I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, well, we're socialized in a lot of different ways, most of them pretty negative, right? We either have really disconnected sex, and we know that that's not satisfying for people. And so they may feel some shame, or at least some longing in those situations. And then a lot of religious teachings might have some shame in it. We know a lot of that has to do with how people interpret that doctrine too. Some religious people view sex as sanctified, right? Like, this is something given from God, and it's a really beautiful part of my relationship. So we know that shame, though, comes from, like we said, a variety of sources. I think that society has made it a little taboo. It's certainly something that we don't talk about. And sometimes when we don't talk about things, it starts to take this cloak of shame.
Yeah.
And so maybe you had parents who were just awkward, like they didn't know the right vocabulary. They were unsure themselves how to talk about it, so they just didn't. And maybe that created shame for us. So there's a whole, host of reasons why we might feel shame over sex. But again, as we become more mindful just in our general life, we can ask, how come? Why would I be shameful over something that really creates this beautiful connection? We know it creates a physical connection, but that connection goes far beyond the physical connection. We know that some attachment is created during sex. We have heightened levels of oxytocin, which create this bonding effect within our relationship. And emotionally, we're sharing things that are quite vulnerable and beautiful. It's kind of like the most vulnerable part of who we are. We lay open for our partner to see and judge, and hopefully they're accepting. And so it creates this really beautiful dynamic where we give everything, and we create this really strong, lasting bond with them. And, sex is just kind of this little shortcut that we can really quickly create that connection because of the heightened arousal, the heightened physical arousal. We know that it creates this connection. So, yeah, I guess just challenging yourself, asking why I might feel shame over this, and then allowing yourself to slow down and feel the beauty of it, feel the healing part of sex, the connecting element of that emotional vulnerability that we have with each other.
I love that. Like, that approach just sounds so kind. It sounds so gentle,
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, we're learning. Let's understand this a little bit better. This can be a wonderful thing, but also let's
I
be
like
curious.
that you say we're learning because, we talk about some of the, the mechanics of sex and how sometimes it's just a fail, right? Things just don't go right during the experience. And it's so great if couples can just kind of laugh and say, well, that was funny. That was not what we expected this time.
Yep.
Especially when we start to deal with a little bit of sexual dysfunction, like maybe premature ejaculation or, arousal problems. If we can just kind of, instead of focusing so much on the physical mechanics of it, if instead we can focus on this connection that we're feeling with each other, I think it gives this space for us to just say, that was funny, or, better luck next time, or let's try something different,
Yep.
So it creates kind of this ability for us to roll with the punches and just learn with each other.
I love that. And find the humor in it. Often we're so serious around
So
things. Like,
serious.
it's gotta work. And it's like, no, it doesn't always. And that can be funny. And
It can be funny.
I think about when I have a good therapy session, it's often one where we felt some pain and some sadness and some connection, but we've also probably laughed a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, having that range of emotion is so human. I found all those experiences quite connecting, the challenging
Yeah.
moments, but also the lighter side. And
Yeah.
I like that idea where you said, I've never thought about that, but that sexuality can be a shortcut to connection. I love that thought.
Yeah. And I think what you just said is important, that we have this range of emotion. And if we're just so procedural in sex, we really miss out on this range of emotion. There might be a little hurt that's divulged during sex because we're feeling this safe connection with each other. And there likely is going to be some funny moments and some deep, gratitude and sacrifice, all of these other things that come up.
Yeah. Well, I got another big question for you. It's not completely formulated, so I'm going to talk it out and we'll see if this makes any sense. So I like your thought of a lot of this kind of healthy sexuality shows up in the context of a committed relationship. Where there's that trust, there's that safety, you can talk and laugh and enjoy that. And then I think about for a lot of people, prior to that relationship in adolescence, there's really high arousal and desire, and there's not access to a committed relationship or a partner. And I find that a lot of people struggle where they engage in things like pornography viewing or masturbation, and they feel really, really, really bad about themselves. Yeah. And it's like, well, I'm not even old enough to be in this committed relationship. What would you say to individuals around their sexual development and journey where these feelings can be so powerful and you're not really ready for a committed relationship yet?
Yeah. One thing that I like to remind people of is just because we feel arousal, it doesn't mean we have to act on it. We're still in a learning phase, early on. And so what's really helpful, again, is mindfulness. If we can just kind of sit, like once we're feeling that heightened arousal, right? We can just kind of sit with it and be curious, like, oh, this is what arousal feels like. And I wonder how long it will last, and I wonder maybe if I did something that intensified my arousal. And so I can start to be aware of my environment and my circumstances that I create, or that, I just happen into. But I think what's really nice, a really good way to start getting familiar with your arousal and with you as a person, the environment that you're in, is to just sit with it, to just kind of slow that down and say, this is arousal, and take note of what it feels like. Again, go through that mindful process of just moment to moment, how it is my body responds and how I'm processing it mentally and, in other ways.
I think that's so key, because I often work with adults who struggle with compulsive sexual behaviors, like looking at pornography and they don't want to. And often it comes from, I'm feeling a sexual urge and I don't want to feel it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And how can I look at sexual images and masturbate as fast as I can to get rid of it? But if we took more space where it's like, let's understand what arousal even feels like and be curious about that. You don't have to obey an emotion or an urge. Like, you get to choose your actions. And I think about,
I think a lot of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't choose my emotions or arousal, but as we're curious and aware of them, it actually helps us regulate them and manage them better.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say, is that kind of looking for that outlet is a way for us to truncate the experience, right? I'm going to stop it right now because I'm just going to have this release of looking at pornography or going ahead and masturbating, instead of just really experiencing what it is my body is experiencing at the moment, and just being curious about it, not intensifying it, not shaming myself over it.
Yeah.
Just saying, this is what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And it's just like any other appetite. We have this little increase of hunger. And then if we just wait for a minute, maybe 20 minutes, take a drink of water, whatever is kind of slowing it down, that those hunger pains kind of subside.
Yeah.
And same is true with arousal. If we just kind of learn what it is that maybe intensified it or created it, or maybe it was just spontaneous, right? And so just sit with it and see how you feel.
I'm amazed at how intense emotions and arousal can be, but also how temporary they are. They do kind of go up, then they go down. And it's often when it's like, what I'm feeling is bad or sinful, or I can't have this. What does this mean about me? That seems to ramp up the intensity and encourage us. We got to do something to get rid of it. But if we kind of let go of those judgments and just like, this is arousal. This is emotion. It's okay to experience this. It is very manageable in a fairly short amount of time. This isn't like, I got to sit with it for hours. It isn't that. It's a lot shorter process if we allow ourselves to fully engage in it.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that just being accepting of ourselves and understanding even that this is normal, right? Maybe I didn't do anything. Maybe I, wasn't watching, a chick flick or whatever it is that, sometimes might arouse you. I wasn't doing anything, but this is just kind of the rhythm of my body. And maybe I just had heightened arousal for some reason. And acknowledging that that's a normal part of just the rhythms of my body. And I can just notice it.
I like that. And that would be so powerful, just to be able to say to yourself, this is normal. We've got these rhythms. Sometimes these things show up for a reason. Sometimes they don't. And it's normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, just on that note, it's so helpful as a parent to help your child understand this about themselves, that their body has rhythms, that their body, as it develops and starts to mature sexually, you're going to experience these things. So as a parent, if I can help my child, kind of pre-arm my child with this information, when it hits them, when they start to have experiences like this, they won't feel the shame. They won't feel the judgment, the self-judgment that sometimes comes with this, because they feel a little bit out of control, like, wow, where did this come from? And I've got to get rid of it, just like you said. Instead, they'll be aware, oh, this is going to happen. This is a normal part of maturing sexually.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. When I'm working with someone who struggles with like pornography viewing, often they tell me about what it was like to talk to their parents about it, or if parents discovered that they were looking at sexual images or masturbating. And sometimes those moments, those conversations are embedded in their mind because they were so filled with shame. And for some, they were quite traumatic and were damaging to those relationships. Like, what counsel would you give a parent who's trying to help their child navigate kind of the normalness of sexuality, and if they come across sexual images or masturbate, how would you help them have those conversations where they can be learning moments and connecting moments instead of, well, I'm never going to talk to mom and dad about that again? Like, what advice would you give?
Yeah, it's interesting because I always teach that sexuality is meant to strengthen a relationship, to increase the intimacy that two people feel with each other. And that really should be the same for parent and child. When we talk about sex with our children, it should really be this sweet, tender, compassionate conversation where we're teaching them something that's beautiful. Even if we're setting boundaries around sexual behaviors, it can still be done in a really beautiful, connecting sort of way. Instead of this harsh, no, 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 we can instead say, if my child came to me and said, I have been viewing pornography, I might first of all just pause and just help them understand how really grateful I am that they would share something so personal with me. Something that they probably already feel guilty about themselves, because that's why they're coming to disclose this to me. If as a family we have values that watching pornography is not helpful, is not a good thing, right? We're prohibiting that. So for them to come and tell me that, that's a pretty big step for my child to take. And I really want to honor that. And then just help them understand that a lot of times we get caught up in unhealthy behaviors. And I'm on your side. I'm going to help you. Let's see what the landscape is, see what, your pornography viewing looks like, how often, what's the intensity of it, those sorts of things. And then let's make a plan for how to, curtail it at first. We're probably not going to just cold turkey stop watching it. It will probably still be tempted and give in to that. And so let's be realistic about that. We don't have to make a plan to do that, but we can just be realistic. And then just, talk about how to maybe replace that with healthier attitudes. We can't just, white knuckle it and say, I'm never going to look at pornography again. We need to talk about why we were drawn to it in the first place. Why were we curious? Did we not know good information and we thought this was a source? And then we got caught up in bad habits? Or, what's the reason? And try to dissect that and be on their team. And then check in with them occasionally. When we just bombard our children with, how are you doing today? And how are you doing now? And the next hour, how are you doing? That gets exhausting. And so instead, maybe just have a little signal between the two of you, like, everything okay? Wink or whatever. And so check in with them so they know that you're there for them. You're going to help them overcome this.
Well, it's so refreshing to hear you describe that. And I like how the first step is acknowledging the relationship. It's not focus on this behavior that we're uncomfortable with and we don't want. It's like, we're going to get to that. But the first part is like, I care about you. I love you. This is such a big step that you could talk to me. That is what we're shooting for as a parent, is to cultivate those strong relationships so we can have meaningful conversations about life and mental health and sexual development. And to have that relationship, that is core. And to come back and really make them coming to you with these questions a really rewarding experience. and not
Mm-hmm.
a punishing experience. That seems so, so important.
Yeah. And maybe following up, even as they're going through their process of trying to rid themselves of this habit, coming back and just reiterating, I am so proud of the efforts you're making. And I just look at you and I think, I am so grateful to have such a great example in my life,
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's just so many ways that we can create that connection. And again, be vulnerable with each other. Because certainly if your child came to you and is disclosing that, that's huge.
Yep.
But what if they didn't disclose it, right? And you maybe caught them, or you found some evidence of them having a habit of watching porn. The same thing is true. You could just approach it in this loving, gentle, like, I really care about our relationship sort of way, and not that I'm going to thump you on the head because I caught you doing something bad.
It strikes me listening to you, it's like, wow, you really are an expert in human development. That this is a process, that relationships take time. These are conversations. We don't have the sex talk and we're done. That is not how this works. These are conversations. We're cultivating these attitudes and strengthening relationships and learning about ourselves and other people. And this is a lifelong process. So there's going to be mistakes along the way, and we're not always going to get it right. But having that attitude of, how can we come together and be grateful for these opportunities to help one another? I just think that's beautiful.
Yeah, one thing that always strikes me as really odd is that just at the time when our children probably need us most, teenage years, right? They probably need us most. They need our guidance. They pull away, and so do we. We kind of leave them to themselves a little more, kind of under the guise of, oh, well, they're more independent. We just have to be more skillful in how we guide them. We have to be gentle teachers and let them understand that while they're making the decisions in their life, and we are going to give them that space, we also are there for them. We're their backup team, right? We're there to help them through all these bumps and unknowns.
Yeah.
Because as they develop sexually, their brain is literally rewiring. They're relearning almost everything. And so to be left to yourself, to your own wisdom, is really just a sad, sad state.
Yeah.
So we just create all these little tethers with our children. Maybe it's a walk, or maybe it's time alone, or maybe it's we play a game with them. We create all these tethers so that we can have a little influence on these very most important topics.
Yeah, I love that. And too many times I see someone who's struggling with something like pornography, and they feel like it's totally their fault. And if we retrace our steps, it's like, well, you didn't really have those kind of relationships available to talk about this and have somebody help mentor you and guide you. And then it's like, well, yeah, and I struggled, and then everyone just gets mad at you. It's like, oh, that seems really unfair to not get the kind of support that we need with developing through things that are so complex.
Yeah.
Well, you've shared so many meaningful things. If people want to learn more about your work or your projects, how can they find the things you're working on?
I have a website. It's just www.chelomleavitt.com. If you spell Shalom and Leavitt the right way, you'll find me.
And what kind of projects you're working on now, or what resources do you have for folks that might be beneficial to them?
Well, on the website, we have a blog and we have some podcasts, but then we also outline all the latest research that we're working on. And we just finished up about a year ago an intervention teaching couples how to be more sexually mindful in their relationship. And we found that it was really effective. I mean, they had higher levels of communication, lower levels of anxiety, more relational and sexual satisfaction. And so we're following that intervention. We're following it up with another intervention with a population of couples who are even more at risk, and that's military families.
Oh.
And so that's one project we're working on in earnest right now. But then we're also looking at a lot of other models, associations of how sexual mindfulness is associated with sexual functioning, relational functioning, and individual functioning.
Wonderful. I love the work you're doing. I love the application of mindfulness with sexuality. Even though I work with mindfulness and sexuality, when I thought about really merging those, I'm like, whoa, how do we do that? And really, it's a lot simpler than we think. It just takes that intention and that practice, and the rewards, like you mentioned, are across the board. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. Do you have any final words or thoughts you want to share?
I guess I would say that, mindfulness is simple. Sexual mindfulness is simple. It just takes practice, right? So your sexual mindfulness or your mindfulness today, if you keep practicing, it's going to be very different a year from now. But it's all mindfulness, right? It's all a process. And so just keep at it.
Love it. So encouraging. Such a healthy mindset. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
joining
thank
us,
you.
spending some time sharing your work and your wisdom. I learned a lot just listening to you, and I felt like, wow, people would benefit a lot from just having somebody with that attitude. Like, you strike me as someone where I could throw anything at you and you'd be able to absorb it and reflect and engage in that conversation. And we need more people like that that can talk about really important things, but do so in a meaningful, productive, safe way. And that feels like you embody that, which is wonderful.
That's kind of you. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Well, thank you.